I'd like to start off the talk by telling you a story. And this story, you may wonder if it has any relevance to the Bible, but it does. It has to do with Farmer Brown. Farmer Brown was a farmer that lived in the Midwest with his little wife, and this was in the fall of the year that this story has to do with, and it's the harvest time. Now, if any of you have lived in the Midwest or ever lived on a farm, or especially in the harvest time, you'll understand what I'm really talking about. And so they went to town on this particular weekend to see if they couldn't hire some individual to help them with the harvest. But when they got to town, they noticed that around the grocery store anyway, there was no one available to help. So Mr. Brown went down to the pool hall and see if he couldn't find some individuals to help him with the harvest. So he went down there and went on inside, and in the hall was a young fellow playing pool all by himself. And he asked this young man, say, young man, what's your name? And he said, well, my name's John. He said, well, John, now tell me, what are your qualifications for working on the farm during the harvest time? My wife and I need some help. He says, well, I'll tell you, Mr. Brown, he says, I can sleep on a windy night. He says, you can sleep on a windy night? There's no qualification. So he just left and went back to the general store to see if Mrs. Brown had hired anyone, and no, she hadn't seen a soul. So they decided to go back to the pool hall and get John out there in the street where she could have a look at him, because in those days the women didn't go into pool halls. So she got John out on he got John out in the street, and she looked him over. Why, he was about 6'2" and weighed about 195 pounds, and he was well muscled, he was tan, he had calluses in his hands. Why, he looked like a worker. So she said, young man, now tell me, what's your name? He says, John. Now, what are your qualifications for working on the farm during the fall of the year? We need workers. He says, well, I'll tell you, ma'am, just like I told Farmer Brown, I can sleep on a windy night. So they thought that was a real strange individual, so they decided, well, we'll just take him home anyway and see what he does and how he works out. Maybe he is a worker and he's just telling us some funny story. So they took him out to the farm, and they showed him where he was going to bunk and told him about the time they would get up for the chores and what the work was and what was required of him. And so he agreed, and he went off to bed, and they went to bed and got up early in the morning. There was Johnny on the spot, ready to go to work. And they figured, well, John seems like a good worker. They watched him, and he worked hard. He was out there early, and he was out there late, and he was in the field right with Farmer Brown working real hard. And they thought, well, seems like he's going to work out all right, but we'll have to watch him a little while here and see what he does, because they had that strange story, I can sleep on a windy night. So they watched him, and he did have one particular quality that irritated Farmer Brown. And that was that when they were all through with the work during the day, and they came in to do the chores before supper, why, when Farmer Brown was all through with the chores, went in to have supper, John was always late. He seems to had trouble getting his chores done. But they tolerated that because he was such a good worker. Now this went on for about 2 or 3 weeks. Now this was, like I say, in the harvest time, in the fall of the year, and you know what it's like in the Midwest. In fact, have any of you ever lived in the Midwest on a farm? Well, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. So here they were out there on that farm, and one day when they got up early in the morning, it was hot. I mean, it was about 85 degrees early in the morning, and the temperature just kept climbing. By 11 o'clock, it was getting up close to 100, and by noon, it was over 100, and deathly still. Not a breeze was blowing. And Farmer Brown was nervous. Didn't bother John a bit. He just kept on with his work. And then towards the afternoon, as the day wore on, the temperature never dropped, and the breezes never came up. And it was deathly still, and the flies were beginning to bite, and black clouds were building in the east. Now, if you've ever lived on a farm in the Midwest and black clouds begin to build towards evening, and it's deathly still, what does that tell you is about to happen? Sister, there's a storm a-brewing, and Farmer Brown knew it, and he was nervous. But it didn't seem to bother John a bit. John just went about his work and paid attention to what he was doing, and came supper time, and they were supposed to be through with their chores. Farmer Brown went on in to have his supper. I talk dinner, and those places they talk supper in the evening. So he went on in to have his supper, and John was late again, and he was nervous.
And he was edgy and he was irritable, old Farmer Brown, because John was so late again. Finally, John came on in from having his doing his chores to have supper, and sat down. They had their meal, and no more were they through with the meal. Then John went on to bed. He was tired. He'd been working hard all day. But Farmer Brown couldn't seem to relax. He was worried and nervous because the clouds were black and you could smell the storm in the air. Finally, he went to bed about 9 o'clock, and he no more hit that pillow when the shutters banged, the shingles flew, and Farmer Brown was out of bed like a shot. He poked his wife and said, "You get upstairs and get that no-good John out of bed. We're going to lose everything we've got." So he ran out, and putting his suspenders over his shoulders and running out to the barn to see if he could save what livestock and things they had, and Mrs. Brown went upstairs to bang on the door. Banged on the door and said, "John, you've got to wake up and help Farmer Brown." Well, she couldn't get him out of bed. So she banged and banged on that door and says, "John, you've got to get up and help Farmer Brown." But he was sound asleep on a windy night, just like he said. So she ran downstairs out to the old chicken coop to see if she couldn't help Farmer Brown save something. Before it all blew away, you know, they got to get the hens in the hen house because they'll get scattered in the storm. And they ran around to the hen house to close it all up, and why, the hen house was already closed up. The old hens were in there on the roost with the old rooster, just as content as could be. Then they ran around to close the door of the barn because they left the barn door open. And you know what can happen when the wind gets into a barn? Well, it can blow the whole roof off, kill the livestock, and there'll be disaster. So when they ran around to close the door of the barn, well, what do you think they noticed? Why, the barn door is already closed. Then they thought about the haystack they just put up. They had to tie it down or they'd have it blow all away. So they ran around to see if they couldn't find a tarpaulin and some stakes to tie down the haystack. And why, when they ran around to tie down the haystack, why, there it was already tied down. Then they got to worried about their sheep. They had prize sheep that they were going to take to the fair the next day, and they could see them getting scattered in the storm. They were worried about their sheep, kind of like we are. And so they ran around to see if they couldn't tie up the sheep in the pen and close it up so everything would be secure. And what do you think? Why, the sheep were already enclosed in the pen just as comfortable as could be, safe and secure from the storm. Then Mrs. Brown looked at Farmer Brown and said, "Now I know what John said meant when John said, 'I can sleep on a windy night.'" You see, John never went in to take care of his own interests, his supper, his personal interests, until the master's interests were all taken care of. But old Farmer Brown, he ran around in a panic the last minute trying to save something. Now you may say, "Well, that's an interesting little story, but what does that have to do with me here in East Congregation of Citrus Heights?" Well, let me tell you, it has everything to do with you and your future, because there's a storm a-brewing. And if you cannot sense the storm a-brewing, even though there's certain people running around here with white robes on talking about peace, there's something wrong with our sensibilities. This storm has been brewing since 1914. The black clouds have been building. The thunderclaps of World War I and II should have stirred us to action. Real, positive, zealous action. Because the storm is about to hit. Well, now when I'm talking about storms, and you might think, well, yes, a storm. The wind's going to blow and the shingles are going to fly. I'm not talking about that sort of a storm. I'm talking about a storm that has to do with your future. The survival of it will be rare. Few people will survive this storm. In fact, I want you to read here in the book of Matthew, the 24th chapter, what a real weather prophet had to say, and see what he has to say about storms and weather. Matthew 24, verse 21 and 22. And this individual you know quite well. This was the Christ, and he was one who had total control of the elements. He could say to a raging storm at sea, "Be calm," and it would go away. Or he could say to a fig tree, "Wither up and die," and it would wither up and die. He had total control of natural elements, and this is what he says about the storm you and I are faced with, that we have to be able to sleep during or be destroyed during. Here's what it says. "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the world's beginning until now, no, nor will occur again. In fact, unless those days were cut short, no flesh would be saved. So according to the Christ, who knows a lot more about it than we do, the storm that you and I are faced with that has started to develop since 1914, that is about to hit, will destroy all living things. The modern translations say, instead of no flesh would be saved, it says all living things will be destroyed unless he stops it. That's the storm you and I are faced with. Well, that still might not impress you too much. You might think, well, that's a lot of interesting words, but it doesn't mean a whole lot. Well, let's see if we can put it into a perspective that will give some meaning that you will grasp as an individual, and you and your family. When you're talking about destruction here, man has seen some pretty terrible stormy periods. World War I and World War II were pretty stormy, but they're talking about now in the new watchtower, nuclear war. A possibility, a strong possibility of an all-out nuclear suicidal attacks. That will involve you in war. That will involve you in a turmoil, in a windy night that you won't forget. But that'll be nothing compared to the big one that we're talking about. Now, we've also have had disasters. The Spanish influenza during World War I, that killed 20 million people worldwide. China just had an earthquake, they'll admit, killed in one city alone 750,000 people. That's quite a storm. But that's only in one area. And the Spanish flu was worldwide, but that only killed 20 million. World War II only killed 56 million. We're talking about something that'll kill people in the billions. We're talking about, in an area like Sacramento, over 1 million dead. You were talking about in Los Angeles, over 10 or 11 or whatever million there are down there. Tokyo, what does the New Awake say? 20-some million dead. We're talking about mass destruction earthwide. That's what Jesus was talking about when he said this. Now let's read, we read what Jesus said about the storm, that unless God stops it, it'll kill all living things. Let's read what Jehovah says about this storm in Jeremiah the 25th chapter. Turn here in Jeremiah 25 and notice what it says in verse 30. Here, this is really Jehovah talking through Jeremiah, and he says, Jehovah, he says, and as for you, you will prophesy to them all these words, and you must say, from on high Jehovah himself will roar. From his holy dwelling place he will give forth his voice. Without fail he will roar upon his abiding place. A shout like that of those treading the winepress, he will sing out against some of the inhabitants of the earth. Is that what it says? It says against all the inhabitants of the earth. So that, sisters and brothers, involves you and me directly. Notice what else he says. A noise will certainly come clear from the furthest parts of the earth. For there is a controversy that Jehovah has with the nations. He must personally, Jehovah himself, will personally put himself in judgment with some flesh. Is that what it says? It says all flesh. So that involves you directly. Jehovah is judging whether you are to survive or to be destroyed. Then he says, as regards the wicked ones, he must give them to the sword, is the utterance of Jehovah. This is what Jehovah of armies has said. Look, a calamity is going forth from nation to nation, and a great tempest itself will be roused up from the remotest parts of the earth. And those slain by Jehovah will certainly come to be in that day from one end of the earth clear to the other end of the earth. They will not be wailed, neither will they be gathered up or buried. As manure on the surface of the ground they will become. The new watchtower says there will be so few people alive, they'll never be capable of burying them. Jehovah himself will have to do away with this rotting, stinking flesh, this manure on the ground. We're talking about billions. Now this is what Jehovah says about the storm you and I are faced with. I didn't say that. He says that. And as you study your watchtowers on Jeremiah and get further into it in the next few weeks, you'll get the point of what he's talking about. Brothers, we're faced with a disaster, and there's nothing that can deter it. Not even President Carter. So here we're faced with what you would call world panic. Because when people earthwide begin to be destroyed, we're not talking about 20,000 here, 1 million in Sacramento, 10 million in Los Angeles. You're talking about over 4.5 billion people are directly involved in mass destruction. All these people you see flocking to hear the Pope by the millions. And none of those people are really interested in the Bible you found when you go to their door, except rare ones now and then. So here we see what the Jehovah has to say. Well, now, I wonder if we were to read from what the faithful slave has to say, what would they say about this storm you and I are faced with? Jesus said it'll kill all flesh unless Jehovah stops it. Jehovah says they're going to be laying on the ground like dung, fertilizer. Their knees likely dripped with more than mere sweat. Doubtless, they were so weakened in spirit that the sphincter muscles of their bladders released, causing their knees to drip with urine. And brothers, that's being scared. Now, what were they scared of? Something they saw? Not at all. Only something they heard about. They never saw it at all. They only heard about it. You're not going to hear about this destruction when it hits. You're going to be part of it and see it all around you. And if you're not capable of sleeping on that windy night, you'll be part of it. Now back there, Ezekiel was panicky when he heard about it, when Jehovah told him, and he was so upset that when he told it to the other Jews, undoubtedly they were concerned themselves. Now you are hearing the same thing from this platform, just like Ezekiel heard about that destruction back there. The question is, how does it affect you? Well, notice what it says further. The destruction to come upon Christendom will soon be even more frightening. The prophetic report of that calamity contained in God's Word deeply stirs the inward feelings of Jehovah's Christian witnesses. You can tell if you're a witness. Does that deeply stir your inward feelings? Or do you listen and say, well, that was an interesting bit of information, go on home and forget the whole thing? How does it affect you? Does it deeply stir you? Because if it does, you are one of his Christian witnesses. And if it doesn't, well, what does that identify us as? Like we may not even believe it. So it goes on and says, their concern about the safety, that is Jehovah's Witnesses' concern about the safety of fellow humans, then is now motivating Jehovah's Witnesses to be diligent in proclaiming this report so that others may take the steps to escape destruction. How are you responding to that report? Is it causing you to take positive action to seek God's righteousness before he acts? In other words, brothers, can you sleep on a windy night? Have you been putting the Master's interests first or your interests first? What are we doing? Well, you know what you're doing. Here's what a later watchtower says. Let me read you this one. This is a real strong point. August 15th, 1978, page 23 says, but each one of us should be honest with himself. Do you say, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak? You see, I've got this problem. I just can't get to doing the work. I really want to, but I just can't get about it. But is the spirit really willing? Let us avoid using the weakness of the flesh as an excuse for the unwillingness of the spirit. Do you get the point? We blame it on the flesh when it's really the spirit that really doesn't want to do it. So we blame the flesh. Their knees likely dripped with more than mere sweat. Doubtless, they were so weakened in spirit that the sphincter muscles of their bladders released, causing their knees to drip with urine. And brothers, that's being scared. Now, what were they scared of? Something they saw? Not at all. only something they heard about. They never saw it at all. They only heard about it. You're not going to hear about this destruction when it hits. You're going to be part of it and see it all around you. And if you're not capable of sleeping on that windy night, you'll be part of it. Now back there, Ezekiel was panicky when he heard about it, when Jehovah told him, and he was so upset that when he told it to the other Jews, undoubtedly they were concerned themselves. Now you are hearing the same thing from this platform, just like Ezekiel heard about that destruction back there. The question is, how does it affect you? Well, notice what it says further. The destruction to come upon Christendom will soon be even more frightening. The prophetic report of that calamity contained in God's Word deeply stirs the inward feelings of Jehovah's Christian witnesses. You can tell if you're a witness. Does that deeply stir your inward feelings? Or do you listen and say, well, that was an interesting bit of information, go on home and forget the whole thing? How does it affect you? Does it deeply stir you? Because if it does, you are one of his Christian witnesses. And if it doesn't, well, what does that identify us as? Like we may not even believe it. So it goes on and says, their concern about the safety, that is Jehovah's Witnesses' concern about the safety of fellow humans, then is now motivating Jehovah's Witnesses to be diligent in proclaiming this report so that others may take the steps to escape destruction. How are you responding to that report? Is it causing you to take positive action to seek God's righteousness before he acts? In other words, brothers, can you sleep on a windy night? Have you been putting the Master's interests first or your interests first? What are we doing? Well, you know what you're doing. Here's what a later watchtower says. Let me read you this one. This is a real strong point. August 15th, 1978, page 23 says, but each one of us should be honest with himself. Do you say, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak? You see, I've got this problem. I just can't get to doing the work. I really want to, but I just can't get about it. But is the spirit really willing? Let us avoid using the weakness of the flesh as an excuse for the unwillingness of the spirit. Do you get the point? We blame it on the flesh when it's really the spirit that really doesn't want to do it. So we blame the flesh. Well, it's a serious business, because from what the faithful slave says here, this destruction we're faced with is going to be a serious, serious event that's going to affect all of us very deeply. In fact, it agrees with what Jehovah says, and it agrees with what the Christ had to say about the destruction so great that unless it's stopped, it will kill all living things. Now the question is, can you and your family sleep on a windy night? How secure are you? Have you been putting the Master's interest first in your life truly, really? Is he the most important thing in your life? Everything else secondary? Well, you know. Now, I don't know about this area here. You're building a new Kingdom Hall, so there must be some interest in your territory. You think all the sheep are in the pen in this territory? What do some of your elders think? Johnny, what do you think? Think all the sheep are in the pen? No. Still some there. What do some of you others think? Not too sure. I guess they're all gathered, are they? What do some of you other elders? Who are the other elders? Let's find out. What do they think? Johnny? Or Brother Brewer? Is that it? Okay, that's a very interesting point. So how much you work depends on how much you reap, seems to be it. So there is interest out there. And the congregations are out there looking for the sheep. I'm sure your congregation does like ours. You have little meetings for service where you get together and you go out and knock on doors and see if there's a sheep. And you go from door to door and look for sheep. We do. And the congregation here I know does. But the question is, do you do it as an individual? The congregations are zealous. The Jeremiah class is very zealous. But how about us as individuals? Are we zealous in looking for and seeking out these sheep? Well, that's something we have to examine ourselves and make sure we are. Because if we're not, well, it could present a problem. Now, so let's get it down here even more pointed. We've been talking how bad this storm is. Let's kind of talk about the congregation we know is going to survive. All congregations are Jehovah's congregations. As part of an overall large congregation earthwide, it will survive because it is doing God's will. But what about you as an individual, as a family? You husbands, is your wife really zealous and whole-souled in the truth? Is she really dedicated? Is Jehovah the first and primary important personality in her life? Then how about your life? Is Jehovah the center of your life? Or is it something else? Your home or your job or your clothes or your car or your vacation or your money or your whatever? What is the center of your life? Are you whole-souled in your dedication? Well, you may say, yes, I am. Well, I'm sure all of us would if I was to ask you, you'd agree with that. But the question is, what does our action show? Now, I want you to read a scripture here with me in Revelation, and this ties in with all of this, in the 14th chapter of Revelation, and it's verse 6. And here's what not Jeremiah, we're talking here about what John had to say in the Revelation. And he says this about the period we're faced with and the period we're living in today. He said, "And I saw another angel flying in mid-heaven, and he had everlasting good news to declare as glad tidings to those who dwell on the earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people, saying in a loud voice, Fear God and give him glory, because the hour of the judgment by him has arrived. And so worship the one who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and fountains of water." So here this tells us, similar to what Jeremiah said, the hour of the judgment by him has arrived. Jehovah is judging us. And there is, like it says, there's an angel flying in mid-heavens with everlasting good news to declare. Now it says this in verse 7, that it will say this in a loud voice, "Fear God." So listen real close. Let's see if you can hear. Do you hear voices? Well, I hope you don't hear voices. That'd be bad. But it says you're going to hear this in a loud voice. So what is the loud voice that is having this message declared, "Give him glory because the hour of judgment"? What is this loud voice? Have you any idea? Because you're supposed to be able to hear it. Can't you hear it? Have you ever heard it? What is it? Please. The preaching work, yes, it certainly is. That's a loud voice, but there's something that really controls it because, brother? The watchtower on the wake. That's the tool of the faithful slave. That's a loud voice earthwide in millions of copies in how many languages? 72 languages or whatever, 90, I don't know what it is anymore. But it's way up there in a loud voice. Now the question is, when you read this loud voice or hear this coming from the faithful slave, the Jeremiah class, do you believe it? Do you believe what the Jehovah says through the angels, through the Jeremiah class? When you read that destruction is going to be worse than anything that has ever happened, does it move you like it says it will to be zealous in the ministry? Well, you know whether you're zealous or not. Does it really move you? Do you really believe it? Oh, you say, yes, I believe it. Well, I don't think all of us do believe it. Because when you read about what's going on in congregations, we read in our kingdom service a few weeks back, 37,000 became irregular or inactive in the United States. 37,000. They start by being irregular. And they start being irregular by becoming 2 or 3 hour a month publishers. Or 5 hour or whatever it is, unless you're brand new in the truth. That's right, it starts coming down and then it breaks and gets irregular and then becomes totally inactive. Do nothing. 37,000. That's many circuits. There's several districts here in the United States. Now, the reason I bring this up is because it says here that the slave is going to make this available, and we've been told what to do. Those of us that have been in the truth 20, 30 years have never had anything shorted us from the Jeremiah class. We know what to do, we know when to do it, and we know how to do it. But the problem is we sometimes forget and get so we don't believe it anymore. The new Watchtower says that's what's happened among Jehovah's Witnesses. Many have stopped and quit. The time came when they thought something was going to happen, it didn't, so they gave up. Thousands of them. Some who haven't completely given up just sit and wait to see what's going to happen. That kind of reminds me of the man that looks down the barrel of a double-barrel shotgun and pulls the trigger to wait to see what happens. It's deadly. You don't wait to see what happens when it involves Jehovah. You act and do what he asks you to do. Now, I want to read you a scripture here, and this is in the book of Genesis, and this has to do with a family. It's very similar to all of us, who talk to angels, like angels talk through the faithful slave to us. And in the book of Genesis, the 19th chapter, it talks about all of this, and I want to read it and sort of analyze it so we can get the sense of how humans act and don't act, what moves humans and what doesn't move them. Now, when you think of someone who talked to angels, can you think of anyone who ever talked to angels in the Bible? Come on. Please? Lot. There was a good example. Lot had angels come to his house and stay overnight. What would you do if you had angels in your house overnight? Would you talk to them? Can you think of the questions you would have? Why, you'd probably even turn off TV. Of course, you've got them in your house, and I don't know if you read them at all, or turn off the TV, or... Would you really listen to the angels if they... Would you believe what they said if they told you something? Oh, yes, I believe what they'd say, sure. Oh, I believe every word they said if I had angels come to my house, if I knew they were angels. Well, Lot knew these were angels because when they came to town, the homosexuals tried to attack them. Kind of like they might do here in some areas of Sacramento. And so the angels got in the house and they had to blind the crowd so they couldn't find the door. So Lot knew they were angels. And so he had them in the house with him all night. And the angels talked to Lot, had a lot to say to Lot. Lot's wife and his daughters. Now I want you to read this account to show you how ridiculous a human can get. Here's in the 19th chapter at verse 13. And it says this. And in fact, it's so ridiculous, when you read this, you wonder, well, maybe us humans have still got those same qualities. Because the Watchtower is saying to us, as you will study tonight, yeah, tonight you study in the Watchtower. I put before you life and death. What a silly thing to put before Christians. Life and death, well, of course we want life. That's not so. Many want death. He did that to the nation of Israel. I put before you life and death. Choose. They had their temple there. They had Solomon's temple, the priesthood, the whole thing. Yeah, I put before you life and death. And guess what? 99% of them, 99 and 44, 100% of them chose death. So you might think, well, this is all kind of ridiculous. No, it isn't ridiculous. This is the way humans do. They can know something to be the truth and act just the opposite. Now, here's what happened to this little family. Start in verse 13 of the 19th chapter. It says, for we are bringing this place to ruin because of the outcries against them has grown loud before Jehovah, so that Jehovah sent us to bring this city to ruin. That's what the angel said to Lot. Hence, notice what happened. Lot went on out and began to speak to his sons-in-law who were to take his daughters, and he kept on saying, get up, get out of this place, because Jehovah is bringing the city to ruin. But in the eyes of his sons-in-law, he seemed like a man who was joking. I mean, Lot destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. They're the cultural centers of the world. Centers of commerce and trade. Kind of like Sacramento. Destroy Sacramento? There's nothing wrong with Sacramento. Oh, there's a little few rapists running around. That's not too bad. Little adult theaters here and there. Pornography is free and available. The doctors are perverts in many areas. They've got caught 2 of them is all. How many more we don't know. But everything is pretty shaky. So you may, though, get to thinking, well, it's really not so bad. You kind of enjoy R-rated movies. Some who go to halls do. Like the disco, it's not so bad. Why, it's a lot of fun. You like the beat of the music. Not so bad. Get so I kind of like it. Well, that's kind of the way it was back there in Sodom and Gomorrah. The sons-in-law thought Lot was joking, and you know something? Lot didn't even believe what he was saying himself. He didn't believe one word of what he said. Now, he had been told by the angels, get out of this town, we're going to destroy it. So Lot went right on out and he started preaching, get out, God's going to destroy the city. But notice what it says in the next verse. However, when the dawn ascended, that is the next day, then the angels became urgent with Lot, saying, get up. He was still sitting on his whatever he was sitting on. He might have still been in bed, I don't know. But the angel said, get up! Exclamation mark. Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are found here, for fear you may be swept away in the air of the city. Now that should have really moved Lot, because he was out the day before telling people the same thing. And he didn't believe it, because he wasn't acting on even what he preached. Well, you might have put in 2 or 3 hours last month in the ministry telling people the same thing. But is it moving you in the right way to get life in the new system? Do you really believe what you're saying? Well, here's what happened to Lot. Then it says in verse 16, when he kept on lingering, even after that pep talk, it says, when he kept on lingering, then in the compassion of Jehovah upon him, the men seized hold of his hand and the hand of his wife and the hands of his 2 daughters, and they proceeded to bring him out and to station him outside the city. They drug him outside of the city, him and his wife and his 2 daughters. Do you brothers believe that you're not going to be drugged, kicking and screaming into the new system? Well, you're not. We're going to respond on our own, zealously and whole-souled and enthusiastically, or you won't be there. That's what the Christian Greek scriptures tell us. But now notice how ridiculous it all got, to show you there was wrong thinking in the back of the mind of this Lot and his wife and his children. Things weren't right. Things were bad wrong in that family. Notice why I say that. Verse 17, and it came about that as soon as they had brought them forth to the outskirts, he, that is the angel, began to say, escape for your soul. Do not look behind you, and do not stand still in all the district. Escape to the mountainous region, for fear you may be swept away. Then Lot said a very interesting thing. Not that, please, Jehovah. I don't want to go to the mountains. I'm an old man. I can't make it. Don't send me to the mountains. And you read the rest of the account, and finally the angel said, well, fine, go to Zoar, but go. Don't stand here. So he went over to Zoar. And then read what it cost him. Verse 26 says, and his wife began to look around from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. It cost him the life of his wife. 1/4 of that family that Jehovah was trying to save, Jehovah destroyed because they wouldn't obey. But that wasn't the end of the problem. Now, when he went off to the Zoar, he didn't stay there long. It says in verse 30, later Lot went up from Zoar and began dwelling in the mountains. He was told to go to the mountains in the first place, but he wouldn't do it. He wanted to go to Zoar, and then after he got to Zoar, he got tired of Zoar and went back to the mountains. You know what happened there? Well, he got up in the mountains, had relations with his daughters, and they produced children. And you know who the children were that they produced? The tribe of Moab and the sons of Ammon. And you know who they were? They were bitter enemies of the Israelites, that Jehovah condemned all of them, and they were all destroyed by Jehovah eventually. Something was wrong in that family line. But the other side of the family, which was Abraham, were called friends of Jehovah's. Why? Because Abraham did what he was told when he was told to do it. When he was told, you kill your son, he said, fine, son, we're going to the mountain in the morning early. But Lot wasn't like that. His wife was worse, and it cost them everything. There's not an Ammonite or a Moabitess that lives on the earth today. So when I say, how about your family? Is your family secure? You husbands, is your wife really dedicated, whole-souled in her service to Jehovah? Well, you better find out. And you wives, is that husband of yours really zealous and enthusiastic about the ministry and serving Jehovah? Well, you'd better find out. Because when the destruction pressure is applied, what we really are comes to the surface. That's what happened to Lot. That's what happened to his wife and his daughters. Let's not let that happen to us. We don't have to have that happen. We can be secure. You can sleep on a windy night. We can do God's will. Very imperfect people throughout history have. They're no different than us. It's the same God we can have as His Spirit. We don't have to be weak and indecisive and unstable and wishy-washy about things. We can be firm and solid. We can have the faith of Abraham. In fact, we have to have that kind of faith to survive. No one survives without the faith of Abraham. We have to believe, and we have to be willing to do from a heart that loves Jehovah. And when the heart loves Jehovah, it's a joy and you're eager and willing. So I would think it would be for me a terrible blow to have Armageddon come and Armageddon go and see my wife and child or friends laying at my feet dead. What a terrible victory that would be. To go on into the new system and your loved one laying dead at your feet. For Lot to run off to Zoar with his two daughters and end up in the mess he had with his wife back there, a pillar of salt, what a terrible thing. What a joy it would have been if they had responded to what the angel said and acted out of a heart that was full of love for the Creator. Now, like I said, we're not going to be drugged kicking and screaming into the new system. It says in the book of Malachi what Jehovah expects from His people. He wants a complete, whole sacrifice. He doesn't want a lame, sick sacrifice. He wants one that is from the heart. Now, the thing is with Satan, he tries to stir up in you and me the desire of the eye and the desire of the flesh so we can make a showy display. That's what he tried with Jesus, and that's what he's trying with us. And he's very successful with most people. Now, we don't want him to do the same thing with us. We want to be zealous, and we want to do the Master's will, and we want to do it fully because we do love Jehovah and we do love His Son. Now, here's something it says in the book of Luke, and I want you to read this. I'm going to read these out of the Living Bible, and I'm not going to give you the chapter or the verse, so you'll pay close attention to what I read. It says this in Luke, I'll give you the chapter, verse 17. He says, "For when I return," Jesus said, "you will know it beyond all doubt. It will be evident as the lightning that flashes across the sky. And it'll come just as quick. And unless we're awake and prepared for it, you'll be caught unawares." That's how it will come. You ever see lightning flash? One minute there's nothing, and the next minute the sky is full of it. That's the way it'll come, he said. Verse 28 of the 17th chapter says, "And the world will be as it was in the days of Lot. People went about their daily business, eating and drinking, buying and selling, farming and building, until the morning Lot left Sodom. Then fire and brimstone rained down from the heaven and destroyed them all. Yes, it will be business as usual right up to the hour of my return." Then he said, "Remember what happened to Lot's wife. Can your family sleep on a windy night? Are you really secure?" Well, I know not all of us are. So think about it. Are we secure? Let me read you another interesting scripture in the book of Hebrews. And here's what the way it puts it in here is really drives home a point. Here's what Paul said to the Hebrew congregation that applies to us today. In the 6th chapter, I won't tell you the verse, it says, then knowing what lies ahead for you, you won't become bored with being a Christian, nor become spiritually dull and indifferent." See, there's a danger, brothers, we can become bored with being a Christian. There's so much apathy out there. You go door to door to door and nobody's there, and when you find them, they don't care. You find that? It's full of that. And pretty soon, guess who feels the same way? You do. If you're not careful. If you don't view it right and have the right heart attitude, you become bored and spiritually dull. That's in verse 12 of the 6th chapter in Hebrews. Isn't that interesting? Here's another interesting scripture in the book of Corinthians. Corinthians, the 2 Corinthians, the 13th chapter. I'll tell you the verse later. Here's what it says. Paul said, check up on yourselves. Are you really Christians? Do you pass the test? Do you feel Christ's presence and power more and more within you? See, that's the way a Christian feels. A Christian always feels Christ's presence and power more and more and more. The closer you draw to the Christ, that's the way you feel. And some of you in the audience smile when I say this, because I know you've got that feeling. You know what I'm talking about. That's the way you should feel. Because it says this, or are you just pretending to be Christians when actually you aren't at all? Can you sleep on a windy night? Well, that's what Paul says here in the Hebrews, 2 Corinthians 13:5. Do you pass the test? Do you feel Christ's presence and power more and more within you? Or are you just pretending to be Christians when actually you aren't at all? Well, all of us have to make sure of what we are. Because if we want to survive the end of this system, which the Christ says will kill all things if God doesn't stop it, which Jehovah says the earth will be covered with dead people, they'll be like manure on the surface of the ground. The Watchtower says there'll be so many that living will never be able to bury them. It's going to be world panic. So it sounds kind of hopeless, doesn't it? But it really isn't. It's very simple. The whole thing is so simple, it's almost childlike. Notice what Jesus, here in the book of Mark, I want you to really understand this scripture. This is our last one to read, and Mark in the 9th chapter, it's a fascinating scripture because it's Jesus talking to a man that has a real problem. The man has a son who is demonized and has a real trouble. He even throws himself, the demons throw him into the fire to destroy the child. Mark the 9th chapter in verse 21, Jesus and this man are having a discussion, and Jesus said, well, how long has this been happening to him? And the man said, well, from childhood on. And time and again it would throw him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. That's a serious situation. But then notice what the man said. And then notice the reaction of Jesus. The man said, but he says, if you can do anything, have pity on us. And Jesus said, that expression, if you can, exclamation mark, why, he says, all things can be to one if one has faith. What do you mean, Jesus says, if I can? Well, of course I can, if you've got faith. Can you sleep on a windy night? Well, of course you can, if you've got faith. A live faith, not a dead faith. One that moves you to do something. Well, of course you can. Now, that's the man responded very interestingly when Jesus said, well, of course you can, if you have faith. The man said in verse 24, immediately crying out to the father of the young child was saying, I have faith. But then he said something very, very, very humble and fascinating. And if you and I will do this, can you sleep on a windy night? Well, of course you can, because he said, help me out. Please, he says, help me out where I need faith. So if you recognize in yourself, yes, I have faith, that's why I go to these meetings. That's why I sit here and listen to a talk. That's why I do my little service, whatever it is. But Jehovah, please help me out where I need faith. And you know what he'll do? Why, he'll give you the faith that'll be live and active. And will you be able to sleep on a windy night? Well, of course you can, if you have faith.